The way you initialize an object from a class has a lot of implications. That is how you do it, what kind of parameters you have to enter when you're initializing it, as well as the impact it has on the life cycle of an object. So in this lesson, I'm going to quickly talk about the initialization methods and why you have to use them and how you have to use them. Let's go to Xcode. And in Xcode, I'm going to go ahead and start a new command line tool. I'm going to call it initialize. And in the initialize, I'm going to go ahead and start a new class. So let's call this one again a user class. And let's see what we have for it. In here, I'm actually going to go and add 5 different attributes to my class. So these attributes are going to be rate, name, UID, not like that, UID, photo, and email. And to declare all of them, I'm going to use different ways of doing them because each of them has to be initialized in a different way. So this isn't exactly a scientific way of doing it. Some of these might be set in different ways, but for now, I think the way we're going to do it is kind of making sense. So for rate, I'm going to say it's a variable, it's mutable. It is of the type float, and I'm going to say it has to be 0 at the beginning. So when you are initializing a user, its current rate should be 0. Then I'm going to go ahead and say there is a name, and the name is a string, and that's about that. It is not optional. It has to be initialized at some point. Then I'm going to go ahead and say there is a variable UID, which is a string. It is an optional, but an optional that I know really soon it is going to be set. So we have to really set it really soon, almost immediately after the initialization. Then I have another one called variable photo, which is a name of a string, and that is optional. I don't know if my user has a photo or not. And then finally, I had something that is a let. It is a static value. It's a constant, is not gonna change, but we have to set it at initialization. So let me write these really quickly. So rate is set at default. And then name is not optional. And then I have the UID, which will be set real soon, almost immediately. Photo, which is completely optional. And I have an email, which is constant, but can be set at init. So what does it mean? It means that we have these 5 attributes, and let me see how many of them are name, which is not an optional, and email, which is not an optional. I should have mentioned that, not optional. These 2 we have to set no matter what. The others, we can just leave them for now and then decide about them later. Now, Xcode is giving me an error saying that your class has no initializer. So let's go ahead and add an initializer. I'm going to say init, and in the init, I know 2 things that they must be there. So one of them is this. Let me order things so it kind of makes more sense like that. So in my init, I'm going to say input name, which is going to be a string, and an input email, which is again going to be a string, and whatever that init does, I'm going to say self.email is input email, and self.name is going to be input name. So now I have an init that initializes the 2 guys that are not optional. Everybody else, we could deal with them later on. Now, if I go ahead and say var my user is going to be user, is going to say, well, would you like to initialize it with this method? And this is now the only method that we can use to initialize our users, simply because we have overridden the init. We can't use this anymore. Now, sometimes, not just sometimes, a lot of times, you have situations that you have more than one kind of init. Imagine this, my array is nsarray.init, and then in the init, as you can see, we have multiple different types of inits. Init with an array, init with an NSArray, init with a coder object, things that, some of them we know what they are, some of them we don't know what we are. So we have to actually choose which one of these, inits we want to use. And what if I wanted to have that for my user? So I would go in here and say, well, there is another init, and in the other init, the two things that they must be there, they are there. Nobody's gonna have a question about them. But I also have an input photo, which this time it is there. And these two things happen as they should. And then self.photo gets to be input photo as well. So now, if I try to make a user, if I go in here and say var my user, it's going to be user, then I have two what we call flavors of this function. Two different ways of triggering init. One of them would need 2 arguments, one of them would need 3 arguments. Let's say I choose this one. Input name and input email are both empty. And that's pretty much about it. So we have 2 or 3 or 10 or hundreds of different types of inits. And when we have attributes, we have to know whether they're optional or not optional. If they're not optional, they have to be somewhere within our init, or they have to have a default value, such as this one. And then we have to write the body of our init methods. And then depending on our use, we can use this one or the other one or any other one. There is one more kind of initialization that's called a convenience init. I should have mentioned that these guys are called designated inits. So that's a designated init, and also is this one. And then in the next lesson, we're going to talk about a convenience init that helps us, with the special cases and so on. So I'll see you there then.